All right, good morning, everyone. This is Jeremy Maestas again at the NRCS. We'll go ahead and get started. Looks like our participant list is leveled off a bit. I would like to just start here with a little bit of housekeeping. If you're having any issues dialing in, I would recommend you just exit the meeting and try to come back in. I know we're all working off of crowded internet lines at home and whatnot, so this may or may not perform as you would like, but know that we'll have a recording of this available. We're going to put that on the NRCS Idaho YouTube page and can make that link available to everyone afterwards. So let's just, fingers crossed, hope this works well. Everyone is muted right now, and we're going to try to stay that way just for everyone's benefit until the end when we have some time for questions. If you do have questions throughout the demonstration here, I'd recommend just hovering over the bottom of your page, and you'll see a little chat box, and you can enter questions to the group there, and we'll try to answer those at the end. And again, if you have any issues, just don't freak out. We'll have a recording of this available for you later. All right, well, quick introductions here on the line as your presenters here. This is Jeremy Maestas. I work for the West National Technology Support Center for NRCS out of Oregon. And I've got my colleague here, Matt Jones, who's a research scientist at the University of Montana and a partner with our Working Lands for Wildlife team. So I figured I'd start here with a little bit of overview of what this hour is going to be about and set the stage a little bit before I turn it over to Matt. We're here specifically following up on some community meetings that were held in the last couple of months by the Idaho NRCS and partners as they roll out their state's new, what they're calling the Cheatgrass Challenge. So we're not going to go into all the background on what the Cheatgrass Challenge is. I'll point you to some resources if you're not aware of those as we go along. But we are going to talk about some of the remote sensing data that were used behind the scenes to help develop what we call a spatial strategy. So specifically, the Rangeland Analysis Platform and the data sets that are provided there were really helpful in developing this statewide approach, but also as folks were seeing this presented around the state, there was some interest in how can we use this at a project scale? How can you use this in your community to plan and monitor annual grass projects? So that's what we're going to talk about here for the next hour. This is very kind of hands-on and how-to. So we'll give you a little bit of background on the data products, but not a lot of the heavy methods. But we're going to focus most of our time on some demonstration of applications and scenarios and get you thinking about how that might work for projects that you may be considering. And I do want to say before I get into that, Rangeland Analysis Platform was developed in partnership, by the NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife team. And that includes collaborators at the University of Montana. Dr. Brady Allred is kind of the brains behind RAP. Matt Jones, one of the lead researchers developing the remote sensing products we're going to be looking at. So we've got great access to experts here who've helped us develop this tool really to better manage and monitor Western rangelands. Working Lands for Wildlife includes efforts like the Sage-Grouse Initiative and other efforts across the West. And so our team works in partnership with our state and local staff and partners, trying to develop strategic solutions to some of the big threats to Western rangelands. And so we were invited to help Idaho get their head wrapped around the invasive annual grass problem And so for the last year, we are, myself and our science team have really rolled up our sleeves and jumped in with both feet to try to help figure out a strategic path forward on this very complex problem. So we'll show you how some of the data were used in some of the maps you may have already seen, but also, again, the interactive and free web application you can use for your own projects. So with that, I think I would like to just go ahead and jump in. Matt, are you all ready to go?
Yep. Can everybody, you hear me okay, Jeremy?
I can.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, everybody, for being online here today. As Jeremy said, my name is Matthew Jones. I'm a research scientist at the University of Montana and part of the Working Lands for Wildlife science team. And I'm going to walk you through some of this. And I'd just like to say right off the bat, too, thank you all for sort of being willing to sort of embrace some of this data and use it. As someone who's been working in this realm for a long time, it's really exciting and great to see it actually used on the ground by the people that are doing the work. So often we produce these data sets and they sit on the shelf. But I'm really excited to hopefully, empower you folks with some data that you can use in your everyday work. So we'll jump right in here. Like Jeremy was saying, part of our task was to monitor and manage these rangelands all across the West and figure out methods to do that. Is what we were sort of tasked with. And what we found right off the bat, right, was that we knew for a long time was that we weren't really capturing the variability of land cover across Western rangelands with the methods we were using. The plots that we were collecting, incredibly valuable, supremely useful. And if you've collected any of these plots, these NRCS, NRI plots, or these BLM plots, I'd be the first to thank you because they have been the sort of keystone behind what we've built here. But the reality is that, they're limited in their spatial extent and they're limited in time. And that's just, a resource availability issue. We don't have, 100,000 people out there collecting plots, so we can't cover every place. And then for a long time, we had remote sensing products like the NLCD land cover data set that you see down here that was this categorical classification that now covered all of this in terms of space. And it gave us a bit of a repeat in terms of time of every 5 years, and it's been an extremely valuable data set. But again, it doesn't really capture what we know is on the landscape. We don't, we know that a single location isn't just grass, and then the next location next to it just shrub. We know that there's heterogeneity and there's a mix there, where there's a mix of grass and shrub, and there's some bare ground mixed in. There might be some trees. And so we really weren't capturing the variability. So that's what inspired us to take these next steps and build the data that you can find on the RAP. And in a super brief sort of method of how we did it, we combined over 30,000 plots from the NRI and AIM databases. We coupled that with Landsat satellite imagery and a host of other geospatial layers, and then brought it into Google Earth Engine, which essentially is a cloud computing geospatial analysis platform that really allows us to do things we could never do before in terms of data set size, computation power, things like that. And what that allowed us to do was capitalize on machine learning and produce percent cover maps across the entire West at 30-meter resolution, which is about the infield of a baseball diamond. You consider that about 30-meter resolution. So for every one of those pixels across the West, we have a percent cover value of annual forbs and grasses, perennial forbs and grasses, shrubs, trees, and bare ground. So we really are now capturing the variability and heterogeneity across the land surface with this new data. And not only we have sort of the static maps, but we can see these things through time. We're able to produce a map going back into the past from 1984 all the way up to the present in 2019, and we'll continue to do this for every year. Excuse me. So not only sort of can we now have space, but we have time as well. But the big kicker was that these are massive data sets. At 30-meter resolution, these are just terabytes of data here in this stack of data of these maps. And that becomes, again, that problem of it sitting on the shelf. If it's too massive for you to even download onto your laptop or your machine, what's the point in having it? So we developed the RAP, the Rangeland Analysis Platform, for people to be able to access this data easily via their browser, do some analysis and really help you, like in terms of planning and multiple different aspects. So let me go to that real quick. So you can visit this via any browser. Let me double check, Jeremy. Can you see that okay now?
Yes, I can.
Great. So when you go to rangelands.app, you'll get this landing page of the Rangeland Analysis Platform. And a quick caveat. So there's that data I showed, all those maps from 1984 to 2019. That's the land cover data. Okay. The Rangeland Analysis Platform is a means to access that data, a means to analyze that data. And as I'm show you a little bit later, we'll actually have other data sets on the Rangeland Analysis Platform that you can access and use. So this is where you start though, and I'm going to give you just sort of a brief look at this, not go through all the specifics just for the sake of time, but I certainly encourage you to visit the site and explore what's out there. So first off, I'm going to scroll down here where we have a bunch more information about the app itself, a fact sheet, a recorded webinar that we did over a year ago now, I think, but that one has far more detail in terms of what you're going to do at each step in analysis. So if you're interested, you could watch that. But then here's the big key, the RAP user guide. Now I wrote this when we first developed the RAP, and I didn't necessarily expect everybody to read it, but I expected at least a handful of people to read it, but I don't even know if that's happening. So please have a look at the user guide. I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that's in there today, but it's going to be extremely helpful. Just flip through it with a cup of coffee, just get an idea of what's happening there. It's a pretty critical little piece of info. So not to spend too much time on this side of it, but there's tabs up here that give you more information about the RAP. There's an important one here that I'll click on, support and frequently asked questions. There's a contact link, and there you can find Jeremy's contact information as well as mine and as well as Brady's. Feel free to contact us with any questions. There's frequently asked questions, and then a couple of key little ones here, shapefile and view in a GIS. So if you're used to doing things in ARC or another GIS platform like QGIS, and you're going to start using shapefiles, which I'll show you about, they can be tricky. So if yours isn't working, visit the shapefile help here. And then also you can view these data just in ARC if you want. You can't really do much analysis with them, but you can put them behind as layers of a map if you want to do that. And then the final thing I'll point out is that the Rangeland Analysis Platform works best in Chrome. It works in Firefox as well. And those are the two browsers that you really need to be using. If you're using it in an Explorer, you might run into difficulties. So definitely via Chrome or via Firefox is the best way to use the RAP. All right, so let's go straight to the app. So it pops up here with a little option to take a tour of the application. So I would encourage you to do that if you've never visited it before. But I'm going to go straight to the app here. And essentially what we've done is built this on a very straightforward, common Google Maps interface so that most people will kind of have a feel for what's going on and how to quickly navigate around. But the real basics here is you can zoom in and zoom out with the buttons. You can obviously zoom in and zoom out with your mouse and your wheel as you would normally. You can change the backdrop so it to be satellite imagery if you like. And you can search for a specific location if you want to. But here we have the cover data, and you can essentially visualize any one of the plant functional types here by simply clicking on the functional type, and it will update the map. We have now every year going back to 1984 here that you can select a given year to view. We'll go say to 2016, and the map updates. Right here, you'll see the scale bar, and we basically have this sort of scaled to maximize the variability so you can see what's happening on the landscape. You can adjust the opacity of that layer, which is critical if you want to zoom into a given location, right, and outline a pasture or whatever it might be. You can do that by just sort of bringing that opacity way down. By default, it comes up with this mask to exclude croplands, development, and water, which are these gaps that you're seeing here in the data. And that's a critical thing to consider, and I'll show you in a few minutes a slide of why you want to either exclude or not exclude. If I uncheck that, you can see it fills in every pixel across the west. And then also you have the ability to display fire boundaries, because those are it's pretty critical in terms of the analysis, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too, but I'm just going to turn that on real quick. We have them loaded from 1984 to 2017 using something called the MTBS database, and I'll provide a link to that later on. But that essentially gives you every fire boundary for that year that's been recorded by the MTBS. So let's zoom in here a little bit. Your home of Idaho, and you can see a few different fires that have popped up from 2016. And I'll show you in a minute how to use those in analysis too. So I'm going to go to a spot close to home for me, Roundup, Montana. I'm going to, out in eastern Montana, I'm going to use that feature and it'll zoom right into where my location is. And right outside of Roundup is a pasture, an allotment that some folks that we were working with sent us as a shapefile. So let me explain that real quick. So in terms of doing analysis, you can draw features or you can upload a shapefile in order to calculate a time series for the land cover data. So I'm going to upload a shapefile that I have. A key is that the shapefiles need to be zipped. So you got to zip up all those subfiles that make up a shapefile into a zip file, and then you can load it that way. What it immediately is going to do is zoom to the location of that shapefile and give you the outline there of it. It can have multiple polygons as well, if you want to do that. And then you can simply click on it, and it's going to give you the information that was in the table of the shapefile. So you can see if you had multiple polygons, this can be very helpful of, just figuring out which one is which. And then you can calculate the time series. And this is going to pop up in a new panel over here. For those of you that have visited the RAP before and used it, you might see that we're at a slightly different interface here. We've changed the interface to these collapsing panels, which people were saying they couldn't see enough of the map. So we wanted to give them the option to remove everything if you needed to. So here we have for my single polygon, through time, percent cover of perennials, annuals, shrubs, bare ground, and trees, the mean value within that polygon for each year. We also provide annual precipitation by these blue bars. It's kind of small, so you can pop it out if you want to have a quick look at it, like that. You can turn values off and on. Like in this place, we know we don't really have any tree cover, so we're going to get rid of tree cover. And let's say we're not really worried about our annuals. What we're really here to examine is the bare ground and the perennials. We turn everything off but those, and you can see what's happening through time with those two land cover categories. And then also over here, you can download this data, the chart data itself, via a CSV file or an Excel file if you want to bring it into Excel or your own plotting software in order to recreate this graph or combine it with other data that you might have in that location. So you have that ability as well. So now let me, I'm going to clear the map and I'm going to give us one example of drawing your features. So you can draw features here. You click draw features and you see right up here pops up the ability to draw a polygon, a point, or a line. So I'm going to zoom into a spot here where I'm curious of why sort of we have low values here and high values here, and I kind of want to look at both of them and draw a quick polygon here. I draw a second polygon right next door. And then I'm going to calculate the time series. And here what's happening when we do this is it's sending these polygons to the server where all the data is housed and doing a real quick analysis and looking at the pixels within inside it and calculating the mean for every year. So this is doing on-the-fly analysis of your locations. Now there's the risk of doing everything online and live. It's trying. Oh, there we go. It did a good job. So let's collapse this and move these over. So you'll see here's my time series. Looks very similar to the one before. And that's of this one, if you see that it's highlighted. If I click on my next polygon, you see the graph change, and that gives me the information for that polygon. And so you can do the same with points, with lines, whatever you want to use to do the quick analysis. And so I'm going to go back now. There's some important things to consider. Oh, whoops, I forgot to show you fire boundaries. Let me real quick bring up the fire boundaries. And let me find a fire really quickly to show you how that works. So here we had a fire. If you have the fire boundaries turned on, you can click on the fire to tell you the fire name, the date it started, the acres of the fire, and then you can calculate the time series in the same way. I'm not going to do that for the sake of time. You can click calculate time series, and you're going to get your time series appearing right up here in the corner like it normally would, and you can be able to export that data as well. All right. So now I'm going to take us back. That was a real brief overview. I encourage you just to go to the site, mess around with it. You won't be able to break it, at least I hope not. And just go to an area of interest that you know and play with a little bit if you haven't done that already. All right, so now let me get back to my slides here. So I'm going to go through a couple important considerations when any of you are doing analysis using the RAP. And this is really sort of critical stuff to think about. And again, a lot of this is in the user guide, so please have a look at that. So a huge factor here is knowing the history of the land. Here we have a map over Idaho and the neighboring states of fires in orange and vegetation treatments in a pink outline. And you can see the extent of fires, historical fires and vegetation treatments across particularly southern Idaho is absolutely massive. Okay, so anytime you're going into a location, it can be really useful to visit, either use the RAP to look for fire boundaries or visit this site and download and search for fire perimeters in your location. And also there's the Land Treatment Digital Library. Now, the USGS, you might have to ask permission to access some of this, and you might have to sort of give them specific locations, but it is well worthwhile to determine what has been done in that location. If I was to zoom this map out, you would see that this is typical of the entire western extent of U.S. rangelands. We have done a great deal of treatment in response to fire, or not even in response to fire, just treatments in general across the West. So it's really important to know that history. Number two, and I talked briefly about this, of using that excluding crops development and water, and the data that's included in your analysis. So if you do a point, a line, or a polygon, any pixel that intersects those features is going to be included in the analysis. So for a point, it's a single pixel. For a line, it might include multiple pixels, okay? And the same thing for a boundary of a polygon, right? Any pixel that intersects, it's going to be included. If we were to not exclude the croplands development and water, and you drew this polygon, say, over this pasture, it's going to include these crop circles in there as well. And we don't know what was planted in there. The RAP data was not intended to predict what's over croplands, and so this is going to really alter your time series analysis. So what you want to make sure you do is exclude the croplands development and water, so those don't get included in the analysis. There is error associated with this data, okay, and it's really important to take that error into account when you're analyzing the data. So there's error associated with each functional group. And when you're looking at a time series, you need to consider that sort of its range that it's predicting in. So this is perennial forbs and grass cover for a particular location. If we're to look at it through time, you need to sort of think about it with these bounds, so that when it's doing this little jump around, say in these years, you probably want to go, well, you know, it's probably not really changing very much. It's all within the sort of bounds of error. It's hovering around between 40 and 60% during that period of time. So it's really important to consider that. One thing I forgot to show, which I'm going to pop back here and show, is where these errors are shown on the RAP page, because you want to take that into account. So they're on the data tab here. If you go to the data, it describes the vegetation cover data in a little more detail. It gives you those errors right here, so you can always find those. And if you want to download the data, there's a link to download the data here as well, but again, these are massive files. And then Jeremy's going to talk a little bit about some derivative products, specifically what you folks can use for the Cheatgrass challenge, which is available at this link down here. All right, so we'll go back to this. So taking error into account, that's pretty critical. So then we have the idea, this is using satellite Landsat data, okay? So a lot of times, especially in early years, when we only had one satellite up there collecting data for us, we'd have data gaps due to clouds or whatever it might be. And these can affect the land cover data. So these paths right here were paths where it went over, and most likely there was just cloud cover through this region during that time. And so we didn't collect as much data as we'd like, and we end up with this sort of effect of this limited data in different locations. So just take that into account. If you see something odd in the data, go look at that specific year where the plot looks strange and see whether this is one of the factors. Okay, so for the sake of time here too, I'm gonna quit sort of talking at you. I'm going to jump to a different slide here, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy. So a couple things that are important about the wrap. You want to consider this as another tool in your toolbox. It does not replace boots on the ground, okay? They're intended to be used alongside local knowledge. You folks are the experts. You've been to these locations. You know what's there. So please couple this data with what you know is happening on the ground, okay? And use your expert knowledge. It's not for precision monitoring and management, okay? It's not intended to be used in isolation. It's giving you a general look of what's going on through time and use it with the knowledge you have. And these are the things it does for you, right? Historical and spatially complete view of your area. Provide some trends for you through time. Gives you an idea of that land cover variability that we weren't able to get in the past. And again, used alongside local knowledge and data to inform conservation management and action plans. All right, and at this point, I'm gonna hand it over to Jeremy. It's gonna take me just a second here. All right, Jeremy, you should be able to.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can.
All right, perfect. Thanks for setting the stage. Quick and dirty introduction to wrap the platform and wrap the data. For those of you that aren't as familiar with the Cheatgrass Challenge, I'm just going to point you to the Idaho NRCS webpage. There's a tile here that you can select and get a lot more background information on the effort that has been launched here recently. Some really great resources summarizing what the effort's about, a brochure that provides more detailed information on things that people can do and how you can use this locally to prioritize and coordinate projects. So I encourage you to really check this out. Okay, let's get into specific applications for the Cheatgrass Challenge. And in a nutshell, this effort was launched because folks in Idaho know more than anyone the devastating consequences of cheatgrass. We know that cheatgrass doubles the risk of wildfire, but it also has a host of other impacts on the quality of our working lands, our wildlife habitat, our rural economies. So we needed a new path. We're tired of being reactive, and folks wanted to find a proactive way forward on this. And what we all kind of realized we needed was some kind of spatial game plan. In other words, how are we going to go to battle in a way that is informed by what we know about invasive species management and uses new technology to help us in that fight. One of the key premises of this whole concept is, landscape ecology teaches us that context really matters. So if you are working in a landscape like the one on the left, dominated by annuals, trying to defend areas that are maybe low annual grasses at this point, that's going to be a lot harder than working in a landscape like the one on the right, where the neighborhood around you is largely intact. You're much more likely to be successful restoring those lands and keeping annuals out. And so we really needed to incorporate this aspect of management, which is that context matters. Of course, we've always known, invasive species management 101 tells us that we're better off and more successful if we focus here on the right in those areas that aren't too invaded yet. We're implementing prevention measures to keep invasive annuals out. It's more successful long-term, less expensive than ended up in emergency care on the left, where things are already bad and we're simply responding to a fire or a large infestation. And so the nuance here with RAP is that we've now been able to take this concept that we've known from kind of a ground-based perspective and map it out across the state. And so this figure kind of shows you the concept behind what has been done. So we've used this RAP data to develop a spatial strategy here. And essentially what we did was we took the annual forb and grass cover layer that Matt was talking about. Again, that layer doesn't just map cheatgrass, okay? That layer includes all annual forbs and grasses. But in our region, in the Great Basin, it's a pretty good surrogate for invasive annuals. Most of our rangelands in the region do not have a high amount of annuals on a regular basis. They might after a disturbance, but they don't persist very long at high levels. And so for us, this is used as a very good surrogate for the invasive annual grass problem. What we've essentially done is taken that annual grass layer and created this categorical map. So in other words, we binned up the cover that was less than 10%, 11, 25%, on and on, to help us visualize the severity of the problem at large scales, okay? We've also taken a max value over a period of time, in this case, 3 years. And we looked at this 3-year window because when we actually dig into the data, and I'll show you this, it's very obvious that annuals bounce around a lot. So they're very episodic. In fact, you can go from having, you know, a trace to very little annuals to more than 20, 30%, depending on climate and the weather that year. So it's something that we wanted to capture in this to make sure that we weren't just providing one snapshot in time. So what you have is the map on the left was the original categorical map over that 3-year window. And then we produced a more generalized version of that. And Matt used what's called a moving window analysis. Turns out this is more like a 300-meter resolution. And so I describe this as, you know, helping us see the boundaries better of areas that are similar. And so what does the neighborhood look like around you, okay? And we've labeled this layer landscape cover of annuals. And so that's really the base map that you're seeing with the Cheatgrass Challenge. That has helped us figure out, you know, which areas are largely still in low amounts of annuals versus areas that are highly compromised and have a lot of annuals. So that map has been very useful for us, not only in Idaho, but we're using that in other places around the West. I apologize, we did not update this with the link. I'll go back to that and show you this data set. Folks want to use this in their own GIS and make their own maps. We've posted that on a server. You can download that, and I'll provide that to you here before we close.
I also, Jeremy, just put the address in the chat window.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I'm giving you the quick and dirty on this so you can understand a little bit of the process that was involved with developing the strategy. But essentially, we took that map combined with some other RAP-derived products where we were able to essentially map transitioning regions. In other words, where are shrubs giving way to annuals on a large scale? And so that's what these hotspots tell us. Where are the boundaries of those things happening? We use that information in the background to come up with this map here. And so these dashed lines kind of represent the loose transitioning regions, okay? We weren't really comfortable identifying hard boundaries because this is something that's changing through time and space. But in general, looking at the data, these areas we identified as being kind of that transition zone between areas that we're calling core that are regionally intact. They're not perfect. There's patches within those cores that are bad, but as far as what's in the neighborhood around you, they're largely in fairly good shape. They're more like that panel I showed you with the blue neighborhood with a couple of red squares versus the annual grass region, which everything around you is affected by cheatgrass. And so if you're working in that region, you need to understand that context because what's happening in the neighborhood affects you. So this map really gives us that context for local management maybe to be more effective, make sure we're doing the right types of things in the right places. The strategy are the arrows. In other words, how are we going to tackle this problem? Which direction would we prefer to work if given a choice? How can we be proactive and not just sit around and wait for a fire or some crisis, okay? And so the strategy here is described as first defending the core, making sure we don't lose areas that are still fairly intact, meaning they don't have a lot of annuals in them now. Cheatgrass, medusa head, ventonata. We want to then grow those cores too. We don't just want to hold the line. We want to make them bigger and more resilient, kind of maintain and grow the resilience of these cores over time. And then finally, we know we're not going to stop working in the annual grass region. It's an important area where most of Idaho lives. So, we need to work there, but our expectations in those landscapes need to be tempered. We are in a situation where we're largely trying to mitigate the most severe impacts of that cheatgrass fire cycle. You are in a region where it's going to be very hard long-term to maintain or restore sagebrush functioning rangelands just because of what's happening all around you all the time. So this strategy is informing the partnerships out there now, and folks are starting to talk about, okay, well, how would we assemble a whole watershed of land managers and owners to work and contribute towards this overarching strategy that hopefully gives us a chance to maintain these cores over time and make them stronger and bigger. Okay, so I'm going to go through some scenarios shortly in how RAP data can actually be used in planning and monitoring the cheatgrass challenge. And when I was thinking about this, I really summed it up in 3 ways. First, as a reminder, remote sensing data is just one spoke in the hub of your decision-making process on the ground. Don't view it as a replacement for that. So we're just adding this into our workflow, thinking about, okay, now that I have this data, how does that inform what I know on the ground, what our producers are telling us and our permittees are saying, our state and transition models on the ground. All of that works together now. But some key things that this provides for you really gives you that landscape context. What's happening around you? We can use it to identify areas for further site assessment. So where are we going to go before we take an 8-hour drive into, southern Owyhee County? Where are we going to go look first? And then finally, tracking change through time. And this is the real value of this data, in my view, is being able to look pre-treatment or fire back through time. What was this site like? And how might that inform our restoration or rehabilitation planning? Also, after fire and treatment, how are we doing? We often don't have the funding to monitor, and so anything that's free should be in your toolbox, especially if we can develop ways and metrics that are informative in terms of what are we going to do next? Are we headed in the right direction, or do we need to re-intervene? Okay, so that brochure I mentioned to you has a variety of different actions that were recommended by the partners in Idaho that could be taken. It's not prescriptive. It's not meant to be prescriptive. It's meant for folks to think about, well, what fits best in my landscape context? You know, what would be the appropriate type of action? But I'm going to show you a few scenarios based on what might be considered something like prevention or early detection, rapid response, restoration and rehab, and then finally just mitigation and fine fuels management or fuel breaks. So let's go ahead and take a tour around Idaho. I'm going to jump into the RAP application now, and I'm going to walk through 4 quick examples of how this data might be used in the context of the Cheatgrass Challenge, and see where these stars are, right? So first, we're going to go into a large core area up here in the northern part of Idaho. Okay, so I've just zoomed into that star, and up in this valley, here, what's the first thing we notice? I've got turned on here the annual forbin grass cover layer, and the light colors mean there isn't a lot of annuals in this landscape this year. But I do see some hot spots, right? I see something going on in a few places, but largely, you know, this is representing kind of what we had mapped out with those core areas, right? This is pretty much a low amount of annuals. Now, remember, RAP isn't going to give you total confirmation that there's no cheatgrass in this landscape. No remote sensing product will do that. You're going to have to do more detailed mapping, other methods to map for the true prevention to keep annuals out. But I do think there's still utility even in these landscapes. If you live and work in this valley, to be able to peruse and look around for, you know, hot spots like these, and you kind of see, well, what's going on there? So if I were to zoom into one of these and go, well, you know, everything around it looks fairly low to no annuals, but this spot, I'm wondering what's happening here, okay? So I zoom into that, and I want to check this out. So I turn the opacity down. Oh, okay. Not surprising, this is a water trough, right? So you can see that in these heavily disturbed areas, this might be what we would expect, is some disturbance equals a little bit more annuals. We don't know if that's cheatgrass or something to be concerned about, but what it does tell me is maybe that's a spot I'm going to check out the next time I'm in the area, okay? And you can flag some of those things to keep an eye on them. If you want, you can, I'm going to turn on the draw features function. I'm just going to pick a point, and it's going to, when I drop that pin, it's going to analyze the pixel that I dropped that pin into, okay? And I hit calculate time series. And it's going to give me some historical data on what's been happening in that spot. So I have the image that tells me one thing for 1 year, but you know, this chart is really what I'm interested in. I'm just going to turn off stuff I don't care about. And I've left on perennial forbin grass or herbaceous cover, okay, which is fairly good in this area. And then here's our annual forbin grass. So largely low, very, very, very low until about 2011. And so something happened here. Maybe it was when this got installed, but that's peaked up at 24% and come back down here in 2019. So, you know, this is, again, just something to keep an eye on. If this happens to stay high, this might be a potential site you would want to go do something about. But if it drops back down, just as it naturally recovers from the initial installation of that practice, maybe we're not that concerned about it. So this is how I'm thinking about this tool in the context of a core area with some prevention and EDRR, or early detection, rapid response mindset. It's not going to replace, again, all the intensive inventories we might want to do, but it's maybe going to help focus those in the right place. Okay, so I'm going to clear this map, and I'm going to take you to another spot. just north of Twin Falls. Okay, I've just picked some places that you know, popped out to me. I don't know these areas all that well. I know you guys are the experts, and so I wouldn't dare make any definitive judgments about these places, but I want to use these examples. Okay, so we're going to come in here, and I'm actually going to turn on the 2018 imagery and just show you that, you know, here's Twin Falls just shown. Here's an odd pattern. So when I zoom around, I go, man, what happened there? So it turns out, tracked down through our partners, that this was a treatment that happened on BLM ground. I got the polygon for that, and so I just uploaded the shapefile for a treatment that was done here, and I want to kind of, oh, look at that, it actually matches the boundary perfectly. So you can see that something happened here that reduced the annual forb and grass cover a lot relative to the rest of the landscape. So I'm going to just pull up the time series. Of course, you can get the attribute data like Matt was mentioning. And let's clean this up so I can see what's happening. And I'm just going to look at annuals in this case. And first thing I notice, and I want to point out again, is that with annuals, this is very common to see wild swings in the peaks and valleys. I think we need to start thinking more about that when we're planning our treatments, because if we're treating annuals in a year where there isn't much being expressed, we may or may not have as much impact on them. I'm not really sure what specific actions we might want to take there, but I think it merits some attention as you guys think about this and go, okay, well, where would we like to see this go? And when might we want to strategically target those actions? What I do know is that in 2018, this site was as low of annual grass and forb cover as it's been in 35 years. So something happened here, and it turns out that there were a series of treatments done on this site following a 2013 wildfire. And if I were to turn on the fire layer, I can show you that here quick for 2013. There's the boundary. There were a complex of fires in this area that overlapped this treatment area. From what I understand, you know, some herbicide treatments and seeding were done following that, but then more recently in 2017, they started doing some additional follow-up treatments to further push that site towards this favorable perennial dominated situation. And so that's kind of what we're seeing when we get to 2016. It's still looking pretty gnarly, but by 2017 and 2018, the treatments are starting to show up here that were conducted. And so you get to 2019, there were even additional treatments being done. You can see this looks to me like a fuel break that was created here, and maybe some additional treatment going on. This is how I'm, you know, if we're doing these treatments, this could be a very useful free way to track how you're doing through time, maybe determine if you need to come back in and do some more intervention. You know, I'll point out that some of the things that are surprising that they actually stand out, but sometimes we'll actually see, let's go to this post herbicide image in 2018. You can actually see the skips of where maybe the plane didn't overlap, and you see higher amounts of annuals in between those flight paths. Or maybe this soil down here was something that it just didn't take as well there. It didn't affect the cheatgrass as much. So this could inform some targeted spot treatments if you're thinking about follow-up and trying to make sure that your investment is protected and effective over time. All right, I'm going to keep going for the sake of time, and let's go ahead and clear this map and zoom out. And remember that context matters. So that project, again, it's embedded within this kind of annual grass region. So we would expect constant pressure from our neighbors, no fault of their own. We just happen to live in a compromised region where cheatgrass is going to continue to affect this site over time with a lot of pressure because of fires or just reinvasion. But if we go north and we're thinking about this concept of like transition zone management, you know, you get to the area north of, let's say, Cary to Arco. What do you notice? You notice that the severity of annual grasses is starting to diminish as you get up towards your core regions. But we do have this active zone of change where this is kind of where the action's at in terms of a shift at a large scale between perennially dominated rangelands and annual dominated rangelands. So this is a high priority for management. Working in these regions could pay dividends, one, to defend the core, and then two, make it bigger over time and keep this from spreading, even though we know that some of this country up here is more naturally resilient. That could change. You know, the climate forecasts and warmer temperatures, longer growing seasons, you know, favor more cheatgrass. And so I think we need to be conscientious and ready for that. So making sure we defend these places that are still intact, key part of a proactive strategy. But, you know, if I'm looking at this area here, you might even drill in further to observe some patterns. You know, what could we do in this type of a place to proactively make it better? And, you know, I would think about building off of areas that are already fairly low annual. So this spot looks like, you know, Blizzard Mountain, it's called. You know, there's some spots where fairly low amount of annuals in this region, and management might start thinking about pushing it back and making this area bigger down through regions like this where, you know, perhaps some proactive treatments, whether it's herbicides, seeding, or both, could be very useful in keeping cheatgrass at bay. This area looks like it has a very strong aspect effect, and so you'll see a lot of hot spots on south-facing slopes for cheatgrass. Those areas are one fire away from really bleeding into the rest of the landscape and becoming a real sore spot for future risk. So those might be areas we would want to target and try to restore now. If you missed your window and it already burned, those are areas we rapidly respond to and make sure that we don't ignore them. Those are places we want to, you know, address the year of the fire if we can. So with that, I'm going to zoom back out and come to another region and talk about a different suite of practices. Let's go over to Mountain Home and just talk for a minute about, you know, mitigating the worst of the impacts. And so if you go over to Mountain Home, here we are, we've got this area that everybody knows is kind of the heart of the cheatgrass problem, fires and regularly. And you can see that with high amounts of cheatgrass on the landscape, right? But if we zoom in, you know, we start to see some of the practices that are implemented in this region. You know, this is I'm not sure if these are part of the Paradigm project or not, but I can see fuel breaks that have been put in areas of low annual cover within a matrix of higher annual foreground grass cover. Those are things that, you know, if we were to flip back through time, we can actually see them being installed, you know, in the imagery. Looks like 2017, some of that started to be put in, and by, you know, 2018, very clear lines. 2019, maybe Cheatgrass is taking back over some of these fuel breaks, or if they were annually dissed, they hadn't been dissed yet when this imagery was produced. But my point is, fuel breaks are a tool in the toolbox that are, we have big plans for those in some of these landscapes. This could be a very useful monitoring tool if you're charged with keeping an eye on hundreds of miles of fuel breaks every year. This might give us some kind of an early warning that perhaps our fuel breaks are getting reinvaded. We need to retreat them. We want them to be effective, right? So here's the garbage. I'll just show this one, garbage fuel breaks. You can really see these lines, but over time, if they're not maintained or if treatments fail, some of our seedings fail, you'll probably pick some of that up in the imagery and the analysis of the data. So something to keep in mind when it comes to fine fuels management and really trying to break the continuity of cheatgrass across these landscapes in that annual grass region especially. We're going to talk more in a minute about fine fuels management with some additional data that's coming to wrap. I know we're running short on time. I hope you don't mind if we bleed over a little bit past the hour here. I'm going to go back into my slides and just kind of wrap up with a couple comments. So one thing you can do, like Matt showed, if you download the data, remember he said that little box where you can export the actual data to Excel. I did that for a site I found. This is an obvious treatment, but I wanted to show you an example of how you could monitor trend through time, specifically with a treated area and an untreated area. What happens if we didn't do anything? Because some of these, in all reality, we're not going to go back to zero cheatgrass. So we want to know, did we bend the curve? Are we moving in the right direction, in a direction that is better for people and wildlife? So I simply took those 2 points and the data from the spreadsheet in those and used it Excel simple line graph to show you how one might monitor this fairly easily over time to show efficacy, at least some level of documentation that you can combine with your local knowledge, right? So on this site, that treated area, the really light area, is in blue, the untreated in red. And as you can see that those two areas really tracked one another very well through time until about 2002. And there was actually, from what I could tell, a fire in this area. And so at that time, maybe some treatments were done in the treated landscape, and these two graphs start to depart. You see the peaks getting bigger in the untreated area. And this is very common. The amplitude after fire really goes wild on annuals unless we do something about it. And again, here in 2015, this was another fire, and the treated area, the trajectory of the treated area is different than the untreated. So, this difference is really some evidence of, how well are we doing and are we heading in the right direction as far as keeping annuals at bay versus letting them become the dominant player and resulting in these state shifts. Matt, I'm going to switch back over to you right now. I'll just keep it on my control of the slides, but I want to have you wrap up with a few comments on production data.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. So as Jeremy mentioned, we have some other layers coming onto the wrap. So right now you just see the land cover when you go and draw yourself a polygon and say calculate time series or upload your shapefile. But what we've produced and we will sort of have available ideally by this summer or the end of the summer is herbaceous biomass, essentially, herbaceous vegetation production at the same resolution across the entire West, where you'll get pounds per acre within your polygon that you draw. And that will be divided into annuals and perennials. So if you were to draw a little polygon, say, you would get a plot it's probably not going to be a bar plot, it'll probably be a line plot. It looks like this through time, where you can see for every year the amount of pounds per acre, and it would be divided into that attributable to annuals and that attributable to perennials. And then also you should be able to, we're going to make this functionality available, maybe not by the summer, but maybe later on, is that you can look within a year and see sort of in the past year, say, what was the timing of that biomass? When did it peak? When did it start to drop off? In this case, you can see this is a spot that sort of had these bit of dual seasons that responded to spring precip and fall precip. So this data is going to be made available just like the land cover data is, and within basically the same exact wrap interface. So you don't really have to learn any new skills or new tricks. You'll be able to get that data with the drawing of a polygon. You can hop to the next slide, Jeremy. And one thing we see that this might be very useful for, especially in your region, is using this biomass data as sort of a proxy for fuel loads. We're not saying anything right now in terms of these are sort of, critical fire layers, like that are, the people that are in the fire world and the fire modeling, we understand that that's fully a very detailed and, people are experts and I've been doing it for a very long time, but this data can help inform that, where here's an example of a place in Oregon where we were contacted by someone in charge of this, what's called a fire danger rating area. And he basically said, hey, do you have any productivity data where I might be able to get a grip on how much biomass I have out there and how it compares to other years when I knew I had a lot of biomass and I was in trouble in terms of fire. So you could easily go in and look at these specific areas and see the spatial variability and look at the temporal variability as well, the biomass through time, divided out into annuals and perennials, which is going to be critical for you folks in Idaho with the annual grasses and their spread. So this data will be available via the wrap, just like the land cover data always was.
Great, thanks, Matt. And I just, sure, thank you. So, we wanted to plant this seed as something that's coming this year. I think about this in terms of pre-positioning firefighting resources, things that we see them out there on the landscape. We know when we have a couple of good years, we see the buildup of fine fuels, but that's variable too. And so to be able to see across your entire district or your county or your work area, maybe hot spots where, the precip setup and the temperature were just right, where, you have a large production of cheatgrass, that might be something that we want to respond to instead of allowing that to be the source for the next large fire. So all of these tools, again, are part of your workflow. They don't replace the things that you know and that you do, but hopefully through some of these quick examples, you can see their utility. One, give you that context. Two, identify places you might want to rapidly go check out when you're in the field. And then three, to track change through time, and whether that's knowing something about a site before you do a treatment, or tracking and monitoring after you do a treatment or have a fire. So with that, I apologize, we did go over just a touch, but you can always follow up with us. We're happy to help you work through different scenarios or troubleshoot issues. And again, that Cheatgrass Challenge layer that has been developed with a categorical one, Matt provided the link to that. We'll also make that available on the Idaho NRCS webpage that I showed you. So with that, I think I'll wrap up and see if, Matt, can you see the chat box if there are any further questions?
I can, yeah, and I've answered a few of them. The one recent one just came in and said, will the slides be available for download after the presentation?
Yes, we can make those available. Yeah, we can do that as well. And why don't we plan on putting those on that Idaho NRCS Cheatgrass Challenge page?
Yeah, and that was all. There was a few other questions that I answered via the chat box. A couple basic ones I'll just reiterate for everyone that's still on was whether we can tease out cheatgrass versus say Medusa head, and right now we're not at that stage. We're just mapping annual forbs and grasses as a whole. So yeah, it's not specifically cheatgrass that's being mapped, but it's been shown to be a very good proxy for cheatgrass, especially in Idaho. And let me think, there was, I think that was about it. Someone was asking about how to calculate the time series again, but you just showed that again in your presentation. So that should be good. And I will say too that that link to download that layer that Jeremy's talking about is also, a link to it is also available on the RAP landing page. If you click the data tab up top, at the very bottom, there is a link that will take you to that layer as well.
Great, thank you. And you know, just some closing comments. You know, this challenge outside of climate change is probably the greatest challenge we're going to be facing on Western rangelands. It's not an easy task. You know, having tools like this helps us ensure that we don't take our eye off the ball. You know, one-time treatments aren't likely to be effective with this, and so I think we should be aware of that. And we now have the ability to at least remotely keep an eye on things and see and make sure that those initial investments aren't lost as we move through time and try to build that resilience. But the strategy that the Idaho partners have put together, I really want to thank Curtis Elke, the state conservationist, James Eller, his staff there in Idaho and RCS, and all of the partners that were part of that cheatgrass technical team for having the courage to step up and provide leadership on something that the rest of the West is trying to figure out too. And so I think this example is inspiring other states. We've got our partners at the Western Governors Association taking a hard look at this model and really trying to share it with other states as well. So keep up what you're doing. I really encourage those locals who to dive in and let's see those demonstrations on the ground that we can move the needle on this problem. And hopefully that strategy now provides us with a smarter game plan for going about this rather than just kind of one-off postage stamp projects. We have designed large-scale stuff that's more likely to be effective through time. So with that, I'll wrap up and just say thank you. Again, the webinar will be posted and recorded to the NRCS Idaho webpage. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.